Good day, everybody. I'm Jeff Edwards from University of Wyoming Extension. This is Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm here with my co-host, Jeremiah Vardaman. Jeremiah, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Kind of have a special presentation tonight, or today, or whenever you happen to be watching it. Part of Barnyards and Backyards Live is Jenny Thompson. You probably won't be able to see her, but you might be able to hear her during the program. But our guest today is Caleb Carter. Hello, Caleb. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great.
Good to see you. Caleb Carter is district manager for Weston County Natural Resource District, and we are going to be spending some time talking about irrigation in gardens and using newer technology, maybe, hopefully. But before we dive in, let's do a little housekeeping things. For those of you that are watching via Zoom, let me remember what our formats are. If you have questions, please use your mouse and scroll over your window and go to the Q&A or the chat box and type into those, and we will bring those forward to Caleb, questions or comments. And then if you're watching on Facebook, please use the comment box and type your question there, and Jenny will bring those over to us, and we will do our best to get your questions answered. So without any further ado, Caleb, I think we're ready to just go ahead and turn the topic over to you, and let's get after it.
All right, sounds good. Well, if any questions come in while we're going through this, let me know and we can certainly address those. So,
It worked a minute ago.
No, I'm just shifting screens here a little bit so
Okay.
I can still see you guys, maybe. Okay. There we go. The test run works one way, and then you go and do it on the live show, and then it decides to switch things around on you. All right. Well, thanks for having me on today, and excited to talk a little bit about efficient landscape irrigation and kind of give some ideas, some options, and ways that we can set up some different irrigation systems and how we can kind of go about using our water more efficiently and more, based on the needs of our plants. So I did watch the presentation from last week, and it seemed like there was a lot of interest in drip irrigation and kind of how to go about setting up a drip system. And I think a lot of times people get intimidated by it because they don't understand all the different components and they don't understand, how to set it up. And so talk a little bit about that today. And it really is pretty simple. And I hope that anybody watching this will walk away with that feeling in mind, is that it's simple and it's something I can do, because that's really the goal of this tonight. So the first thing is, let's
Hold
start.
on, Caleb. Hold on before you get going. Yep. You're not sharing your screen if you're trying to do that.
Oh.
At least on my end, I'm not seeing the screen.
Yep. That's what I forgot. Okay. There we go. Okay.
Yep.
How's that?
Yep. Now we're all good.
All right. Thank you. Yep. I'm just so excited to jump into this. I forgot to share the screen and actually let everybody else see it. Okay. So, jumping in here, like I said, we want to help people walk away from this discussion today feeling like this is something they can do. So we're going to start at the hose connection. And this could be a hose. This could also just connect at your, hose bib connection or a hydrant, whatever you have access to. But there are some important things that we need to include at that connection point in order to make this system work properly, but to also protect the water system that you're getting the water from. And the first thing there that we're going to want to connect is a backflow prevention device that's going to prevent water from your drip system getting sucked back up into your water well or into the city municipal water source or whatever you're using. That's really important to have, just to try and prevent any types of contamination. The next thing that we're going to want to think about is a backflow or a pressure regulator, because generally speaking, we're looking at systems that are running on pressure anywhere from 10 psi up to 25 or 30, which is generally much less than the pressure we're getting out of our water system. And it helps the whole system to work more efficiently if we're working at the right pressure. Next is we're going to want to use a filtration system. That's going to help keep our emitters, which are typically very small openings, from getting clogged and help that system continue to work well. In this system that I have this here, that gray and the white, we're actually seeing here are some additional connectors just to make everything fit right and have the right connections. Then we move to number 5 here. That is a vacuum relief valve. Depending on the size of your system and how it's laid out, if it doesn't have a natural drain area where it can drain air off, you might need that to be able to help air flow in and out of the system as it's pressurized and depressurized. And then we get to the important part where we have a connector that actually connects us into our main line for our drip system. And one of the things to think about, I've got a picture of a filter here. That's typically what you're going to find on the inside. The water goes through that mesh screen that catches any sediment or any contaminants that might be in the water. So you do need to periodically take that filter apart, flush it with some fresh water, just let it clean itself out, run some water through that system, through that filter a little bit as well. And we'll talk more about maintenance here at the end, but just want people to know kind of what that looks like. And if you look at the filter in the system here, it's actually got a valve at the bottom you can open, and that allows you to flush that filter. Sometimes, like in the other picture on the right here, it just has a cap that you take off and accomplishes the same thing, and that just helps keep that filtration system clean. So that's a good idea to do periodically, especially if you know you've got water that has got some contamination in it and sediment that's carrying.
So Caleb,
yep.
Not to interrupt, but you kind of just dove right into drip irrigation components. Why would we want to consider using drip irrigation, and what is it most likely used for?
That's a good idea. Sorry, Jeff.
That's okay.
Yeah, just jumping in there. No, that's a really good question.
Excited for the topic.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And it is good to talk about that. So, as I think back growing up, when my mom watered our yard, it was usually with some kind of a sprinkler that was hooked up to the end of a hose, and then she would run it for, 20 or 30 minutes, or if you're like me, 2 hours because you forget it's running.
Sure.
Right. And I'm pretty good at that. And, and then if she's trying to water plants, like, we had a creek running through our property and we got plants on the other side of the creek. So she would just put her thumb over the hose and spray some water over there to get to those plants. And she would just drag a hose all around. And really, when we talk about efficiently using water, the efficiency is calculated by how much water is coming out of the hose versus how much is actually getting to the root of the plant we're trying to benefit. And when we talk about that, those examples, it's pretty easy to see, well, there's obviously some inefficiency there. And are we getting the water exactly where it needs to be? Are we watering the correct amount? And the other thing is that you have to be out there managing that on a regular basis. You have to move the sprinkler. You have to drag the hose around. You have to remember to water is part of it too, right? And so when we start talking about drip irrigation and start talking about utilizing that, obviously timers could be utilized with a hose and a sprinkler. So we do have some control over how long we water if we wanted to set that kind of a system up, but we still have to move that sprinkler around and turn it back on. And inevitably, we're also watering plants we don't want. So we're watering weeds, we're watering our driveway or our patio or our walkway. We're getting weeds coming up in areas where they maybe wouldn't if we weren't providing extra water. And so some of the benefits of drip irrigation is when we start talking about efficiency is it allows us to place the water exactly where we want it, which is right alongside of the plant we're trying to grow, whether it's a flower or a tree or a shrub or our garden or so on and so forth.
So Caleb, I've seen in the literature places where drip irrigation is 95% efficient.
Yeah.
I mean, something like that, as opposed to normal traditional sprinkler irrigation or other mechanism to get water out.
Yeah, I mean, even if we're trying to be succinct with our sprinkler irrigation and our hoses and so on and so forth, if we're getting 50% irrigation with efficiency with that, we're probably doing pretty good. So yeah, 95% efficiency for drip irrigation is probably a pretty good estimate. And that little bit of loss is put in there just because we assume that there's a little bit evaporative loss once the water hits the soil.
Or some of your fittings might have leaks, or the squirrels might have chewed the end off, or something like that.
The frustrations of irrigation in Wyoming, right?
Something did something to you.
Yeah, drip irrigation is wonderful, especially after you get it all set up and you lay your mulch over the top of it and you can't even see it and you just know it's working. And then all of a sudden you have this big puddle and you can't figure out why. And then you realize that the moles or the gophers or the voles or something chewed a hole in your line and
or a geyser, right?
Or a geyser.
Straight up in the air.
So along with my first question, where would you recommend, in what settings? I can't imagine that we would use drip in turf, but can it be used in gardens? Can it be used in your shrub beds? Can it be used around trees? Is that where you would recommend that it be used?
Yeah, I think so. And we'll talk a little bit about design and how to kind of figure that out and plan for it. But yeah, I think drip irrigation is very suitable for our tree and shrub plantings, for our flower beds, our perennial beds, as well as our garden. The nice thing about this drip irrigation, because we're not burying it in the ground, we have that flexibility that as our landscape changes, we can make adjustments to it. We can add lines, we can plug holes if we're not using them anymore. And so it really is suited for those plantings where, you've got mulch bed and you want to provide irrigation, but you want to provide it just to the crop or to the plants and then not water the whole bed so that you're not having to pull weeds from everywhere. And I actually have heard of people putting what would be considered subsurface drip irrigation on their lawns, where they would actually bury drip lines in the ground and water their lawns. One of the biggest complaints I've heard from it, though, is that your lawn tends to look kind of dingy because it doesn't ever get watered, but it's still collecting dust from the wind blowing on it and stuff. And so I guess it does work, but I probably wouldn't do it.
There are a couple of
expensive too to bury all those lines, and if you have a hole, you got to, or the pipe breaks or has a hole in it, whatever, you got to dig it up and start again, and pretty costly.
There's a couple municipalities around the state and in the Panhandle of Nebraska that have installed it in their football fields.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Sports fields. So
yeah, I could see the benefit of that. I guess it's you're not spraying it, so I don't know. In theory, could you play on it while it's watering? I don't know.
More
I don't know
than
if you'd want to do that, but
well, and I think the other thing that you're talking about, Caleb, and you've kind of touched on it, is that most homeowners often apply 50% more water than is needed to support their plants. And so especially if we're doing aerial application of water or in other means, this drip irrigation is a more precise way of putting exactly what water is needed for the plant, but it still takes management on your part to make sure you're dialing that water in, so you're not giving too much, but also not giving too little, right?
It does. And and I think, it's easy to fall into that trap too, where you're like, well, if that 20-minute irrigation on my lawn was good, then 40 minutes will be even better, and I'm going to have the best lawn on the block because I just watered my lawn for 40 minutes. And or like I mentioned earlier, you just forget and don't go change it for an hour or hour and a half or so, and it just keeps running. And essentially you reach a point where it's just running down the sidewalk or down the gutter or under your neighbor's property or somewhere, and it's not benefiting you anymore at that point. So so there definitely are factors to consider and benefits from looking at drip irrigation. Again, for your lawn, is it the most beneficial? Probably not. But there are some concepts that we're going to talk about today that can help us, again, dial in better how we can water not only our drip irrigation settings, like our perennial beds and gardens and trees and shrubs and so on, but some of the process that I'm going to talk about here in a minute about determining when to water and how much to water could also be used to be better managers of our lawn irrigation. And we could use a timer for our sprinkler, say, okay, I'm going to water right here for 20 minutes, and then it'll shut off. And when I remember, I'll come back and move it to the next section and set it for another 20 minutes or however long it needs to be. So now if you have a sprinkler system on your lawn, then you have the option to go in there and program each of those zones differently. And in the house we lived in previously, we had a sprinkler system, and I experimented around and figured out what zones needed more water and which zones needed less, and was trying to avoid running water down the gutter because it was happening the way that it was programmed by the previous homeowner. So
Caleb,
especially if you're on a well, right? So if you, or even municipality, but I see it more in a well setting. If you have a well, and it's everything, right? It's your domestic water supply to the house, but also you're trying to do some landscape around the property. There are some wells out there that are not as high of producers and don't have an unlimited water supply. And so being frugal with that water is very, very important, and putting on enough water to make it work. And so not running that well dry because no one wants to go without a shower that day, right?
Yeah.
So Caleb, to kind of get back to your slide that we started with, you've described the components of the drip irrigation system, but they can be really simple or they can be very complex, right? One of the individuals that I used to work with in the Master Gardeners, he spent a lot of time promoting drip irrigation and setting it up as simply as a 5-gallon bucket hung 3 feet in the air, an attached drip line, and you have enough water and pressure in that system to provide water to a 100-foot line of drip tape. So it can be really simple.
Yeah, no, it can. And I've actually worked with some folks up here in Newcastle that have purchased some trees and planted some tree rows recently on property that they own where they don't have access to water. And that's essentially what they did. They put a bucket on top of a hill and they're just gravity feeding it down to the trees. And I've looked at some different systems where people have even taken 50-gallon barrels and mounted them, 6 feet off the ground, and they fill that up and they can water. Geez, they had probably half a dozen, drip lines coming off of that, watering, 100 foot each. Yeah. And so, yeah, and I think that's important to talk about too, because people look at it and they see all these components, they see all this terminology and stuff, and pretty soon they're like, oh, geez, I don't think I can do that. And it's like, well, it really is basically putting water somewhere where it can either, gravity feed, or if you've already got a pressurized system, then it's just harnessing that and directing the water where you want it.
Water always runs downhill.
Yep.
So go ahead.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. That's all good to talk about. So this picture here just kind of shows a view of a setup here. And this just shows I mean, if you want to start getting complex, you've got your hydrant with a splitter, and then a hose coming off one side of that splitter, another splitter coming off the other side with 2 timers. And then you can see the backflow or the pressure regulators, the filters, and everything going all the way down to where it connects with the hose right here and then up here. So at the top. And this is set up so you can have multiple zones. Now there's some other ways, there's some other devices that have come out that can actually simplify this process a lot. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the basic components of a drip system. And so I showed you kind of the setup for the backflow preventer and the pressure regulator and the filter, and then the transition into the drip line. So if you would like to still use that hose, water access for a hose, having a Y splitter there where you can attach a hose one side and the drip system comes off the other still allows you that flexibility, which is really nice without having to continually take it on and off. So from there, we're going to have that system we just talked about. We're going to transition to a main line. And typically, if you go to most stores and most supply centers that are providing these drip irrigation components, most of the time you're going to find 1/2-inch drip line or main line for drip systems. And for the most part, that's going to be sufficient for most of what we're doing. Now, if you've got a really long run that you're doing, if you're trying to water a big tree row or something like that, then you might need to upgrade to like a 3/4 inch line to get the water out there. You could also even run an inch pipe, PVC pipe too, if you want to do something like that as well to get the water out to the site. But typically, most common, especially if you're looking at kits, online and so on, you're going to find 1/2-inch line. Now, if we move down from there, then we've got these connectors, and those connectors allow you to make corners to connect and to divert water in different directions. And this poly pipe is really good about bending, and it's pretty flexible, and you can turn it in different directions and things like that. But if you try to make a 90-degree corner, you'll end up kinking it, and then you won't get water where you need to go. So you can get elbows that'll help you direct water in that direction. You can do T's. You can, this plug like this linear plug here is where you would connect for like a 1/4 inch drip line, for example. And you can use that drip line then to go out to individual plants, and I'll show that here in just a minute. And once you get the water where you want it to be, you can either attach emitters directly to your main line by punching a hole in it and adding an emitter similar to these here. And these emitters usually are either 1, 2, or 4 gallons per hour is typically how they're rated. Now you might find some different variations on that, but that's kind of the standard for those. And you can regulate how much water you're applying to individual plants based on what size of emitter you are placing next to it. And the nice thing about that is it gives you control over how much water to apply to individual plants, but it also allows you to have a variety of plants and water needs on the same zone simply by placing more emitters on one plant and fewer and in different sizes of emitters as well. So it helps you really build the system based on what your water needs are for what you're putting this in, whether it's a garden or perennial bed. Maybe you've got some shrubs and some perennials in the same area where you're trying to water. Another nice thing about drip systems is you can use valves and place those in line, and those can help you to turn on and off different sections. If you're, say if you have a big garden and you didn't plant a certain section or you haven't planted it yet, you can if you have a valve going to that section, you can turn it off and keep water from going down to that portion of the garden. until you get it planted, until you get something in there. It allows you, again, to have some flexibility in your system. And really handy way to close off your system, which allows you to still have access to opening it up to flush out your main line, is to use one of these figure eights. And it actually, you slide the main line in one side, fold it over, slide the end back in the other side, and it holds it tight so that water's not escaping from the end, but then also quickly and easily can undo that and gain access to it and run water through that main line to flush it. Some other handy tools that help make your system or make the installation really helpful is a good pair of shears that help cut the pipe. And then this one at the top here that has the little nub sticking out here is really handy for poking holes in the main line. And then you can insert plugs to divert water down a 1/4-inch line, or you can insert emitters directly into that line. And they make plugs that you just kind of push in, but the handheld ones where it acts a little bit more like scissors kind of gives you a little more leverage, so can be helpful in that regard.
So Caleb, there's one more tool that I would recommend.
Okay.
And I don't even know what it's called or how to describe it, but it will actually take these little 1/4-inch bird connectors and shove it into the 1/4-inch line, which
okay.
The older I get, the less nimble my fingers are.
Yeah.
And it is a very valuable tool, fiddling around with these little tiny parts and pieces in order to help you set up your system. So my recommendation is, if they offer tools, be sure to purchase them, because it'll make your life a whole lot easier.
Yes, it does. So do you poke the hole and then use this tool to insert the 1/4-inch adapter in?
Yeah, so I have a tool that's similar to the scissors with the hole punch.
Okay.
It's similar to that. It's not exactly the same thing. But then I'll take it off the main feed line and then drop one of these 1/4-inch connectors into this other tool that forces it into the end of the 1/4-inch line. And then I can take that line and poke it into the hole that I made into the header line. So
yeah, I need to get one of those.
It's very helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're here to tell everybody, is all the tips and tricks and the stuff to make this easier, and because when it's easier, it's more fun, right?
Yeah. So the other thing too, Jenny has asked, on the emitters that you have different colored ones here. Do the different colors mean something?
Yeah. So typically they're color coded, and the colors correspond to the flow rate that they put out. They're usually labeled as well on the emitter, but I don't know that those color codes necessarily correspond between companies. And so don't assume that you buy a red one from one company and a red one from another company that you're getting the same flow rate. Always double check what you're actually getting, and if it's the correct model or a correct flow rate that you're wanting. Make sure that you're checking with that individual company on their own flow charts to make sure of that. But yes, those color codes, the colors are coded to different flow rates.
So Jenny, the resourceful person that she is, has gone out and found a picture of the tool that I'm talking about.
Oh, really?
And we'll post a link to it in the chat and also into the Zoom comments. But yeah, awesome. I don't even think it has a name, or fit. What's it called? 1/4-inch barb fitting insertion tool for irrigation tubing.
There you go.
Don't Google that.
If nothing else,
anything,
call it what it does, right?
Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. Thanks for finding that, Jenny. I'm definitely going to get one of those, because I have felt the sore hands after a long day of trying to put that system together. The other really important tip we should mention here is pull your main line out and let it sit in the sun for about an hour on a nice warm day. before you try to put your system together. Otherwise, you will not be a happy camper by the end of the day.
Yeah,
they're pretty stiff and they're wound up pretty tight, and you got to get that plastic to relax.
It might cause you
so
to
it'll
swear
lay
a
flat.
little.
What's that?
It might cause you to swear a little.
Yeah, it might. Yeah, it might. So definitely don't want to do this on a cold, windy day. It will be, I guess, unless you have the tool, maybe that tool would help. But trying to punch holes in that stuff when it's hard and cold is
use the proper tool for the job. It's the best thing that I can recommend.
Yeah.
So what's next, Caleb?
The other thing I have up here is just as a stake. They make different sizes of stakes for different sizes of line, whether it's 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, or the 1/4 inch line. And those are really helpful as well, and will also save you a lot of heartache and frustration. Otherwise, you're going to end up putting rocks all over it to try and keep it where you want it, and that doesn't look good. So,
or poking sticks in over the top of it to try to hold it down.
Yep,
I've done that before too. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next thing you want to do, or the first thing you really want to do, is, now that we're kind of familiar with some of the components and how they work, is take a look at your landscape and figure out where you want to put your drip irrigation. Okay, what is it you're trying to water, and start to identify your different zones. And now kind of think about your zones like putting similar plants and similar planting areas together, if possible. That doesn't mean that you can't diversify. Like we said earlier, you can, change your output a little bit to different plants on the same zone by placing different emitters and different numbers of emitters on those plants. But at the same time, if you can keep similar water need plants together on the same zone, then when you start going to the step of determining how much water to apply and how often to apply it, it makes that decision and that calculation much simpler, because you're just like, well, this whole zone needs this much water, and so this is what we're going to apply at this amount and this often. And so really just getting a piece of graph paper out and really just sketching out your landscape can be really helpful. Now, also, if you draw it to scale, it's also going to help you estimate, how much material you should purchase as well. And I would always recommend ordering a little bit more, because it's never going to run as straight as the lines on this drawing. And so you will inevitably end up needing more line. And purchasing this poly pipe, for example, the more you buy, like anything, you're going to typically get a better price for it. So, estimate how much you're going to need, add some extra, and save yourself the headache of trying to spend a whole day setting this up and realize that you're 25 feet short when you get to the end.
Isn't that the typical response? The more you buy, the more you save. Isn't that the sales tactic?
Yeah, I wish that worked with gasoline.
Not sure it's a sale, or savings, but yeah, you get a discount for a bulk rate, right?
Yeah, I mean, things that you can get a bulk rate for, I guess, is what I'm getting at. If you can get the bulk rate for things, look at that as an option. Most supply companies will sell the main line in you can buy it in 100-foot sections, but you can also buy 200 or 300 or 500-foot sections as well. And plan big.
You can get it in more than that. You can get 1,500 feet or 3,000 feet, or whatever you think you need.
Semi loads.
Yeah.
So let's look at this. I mean, this is a great way to start, because not only are you going to get a good idea of what you're planting and where and what that's going to look like, but you can start to also figure out how much main line you need, how much 1/4 inch line you're going to need, how many connectors you need. And you can label that on your drawing as well, and what kind of emitters you're going to need. Color code your drawing the same way that the emitters are color coded that you're going to purchase. And makes it really quick and easy to look at your drawing and say, okay, this is what I need, go out and purchase it and get set up to put it together. Now, some other considerations, and this was touched on last week as well, but really determining the flow rate coming from your water source. And the easiest way to do this is to go to your hose bib or your hydrant and get a bucket, either a gallon bucket or a 5-gallon bucket, you know, something that you know the size of it, and time at full force how long it takes to fill that bucket in seconds. Divide the gallons of that bucket by the seconds and multiply it by 3,600 seconds, and that gets you the flow rate in gallons per hour. Now, the benefit of that is that most emitters that you're going to use also have a flow rate based on gallons per hour. And we're, for the most part, unless you're doing a really big system or you know that you're on a well that doesn't have a lot of pressure, typically speaking, we're probably going to be okay on this as long as we keep our zones sized appropriately per recommendations and so on. But it's still a good thing to know to make sure that you're not exceeding the flow rate of your system output, because these emitters and things are designed to work at specific pressures. And if they work at a lower pressure, for example, they're not going to have the same output as what the emitter is designed for. And so you might think you're applying 4 gallons per hour out of each of these emitters to your trees, but you might only be doing 2, and your system isn't operating the correct way and certainly not as efficiently as it could be. So it is a good thing to know. So start to think about how many zones you want to put in your garden. So if we look at this example, they've got 3 different zones. They've got one for their shrubs, one for their trees and large shrubs, and then one for their garden. So that's kind of a logical way to set it up if everything is accessible and you're able to do that. Depending on how your landscape is, though, it might make more sense because you've got trees that are way out there at the end of where you're going to water your garden, for example, or something like that, and it makes more sense to tie those in. So you know, it's going to look different for everybody how this is laid out, but drawing it out and making some notes and starting to think things through ahead of time will help you a lot, so that when you do get down to the nitty-gritty of actually laying this out and putting it together, you've got a plan, you've got everything that you need for it.
The other thing I would add to that, Caleb,
oh yeah, go ahead.
The biggest thing I think when you start designing this and looking at how to lay it out is just keep it simple.
Yeah.
Do the design as simple as possible. You know, use as little a hose as you have to use to accomplish what you're trying to irrigate, right? Mm-hmm. Keep it simple, because with these, we can get very complex, very complicated over a long period of time. Try and use one valve use only one valve instead of 3 valves kind of idea. So simplify your drawings as much as possible. And that's what helps with this planning stage, is you can look at it over time and try and refine it before you actually go into the project.
Yep. Like my professor in college always told me when we were doing writing assignments, write it and then take out half the words and then you'll be halfway there. So maybe this is the same way. We draw out what we think we want and then we take half of it out and see if we can still make it work. And then we're probably better off. So a lot of different manufacturers have recommendations as to what they recommend for kind of the maximum run length for each zone or each main line. And it can vary a little bit. Kind of a good rule of thumb is to not go more than 200 feet of mainline run for each zone. But again, make sure that you're looking at the specific manufacturer's recommendation for the product you're using, because it is going to vary. And if you get too long, then again, you're going to lose efficiency. You're going to lose some of that performance out of that system, because it's just extended beyond the design specifications. And evaluating the water needs of each zone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And just determining how many components you need. So some other things to think about with flow rate is this kind of maximum flow rate is considered to be 75% of what you calculate. So take that number that you calculate in gallons per hour as your output for your total system. Take 75% of that. That should be about a good estimate of what your output is for that. Oh, whoops. And use the wrong button there. And, you know, if you are concerned about whether you're going to have enough pressure and enough flow, add up all the emitters output on each zone. And that's the total gallons per hour output that that zone is going to require, and make sure that it's less than your total output of your system. And if it's not, if it exceeds the output of your system, then you might need to make smaller zones or, you know, reconfigure things a little bit there. So I have an example here. I've got a few pictures of a drip system that we set up previously at a home I used to have. And we tore out a bunch of juniper shrubs that were in front of and alongside the house. And we were happy to see those go because they were just a mess. But then we had this big blank space and we're like, well, we need to plant some stuff. So we planted some stuff. And then my wife was like, well, I don't want to have to come out and water these all the time. So I told her, I'm like, well, let's set up a drip system. And so we did. And my wife loved it because it worked great and it watered everything and we didn't have to do very much. So you can see here the same setup similar to what we just discussed coming off of our hose there, our spigot. And the first, it runs along the outside of the house there. And you can see, if you look here, doesn't do any good if I point at it, my finger. If you see here, this is our main line running along the house. Right here is a 1/4-inch line that has an emitter plugged into the end of it coming out to this shrub, this perennial here. And then it keeps running along. We've got additional emitters on each of these plants. It runs alongside the house over here. And you can see how we're trying to fill in all this bare space over here alongside the house. And it loops around, it waters that spirea shrub on the far back side there. And then it comes back out and around the house. And we actually set it up to water our plant pots out in front of the house as well, just to show, you know, the flexibility of a system like this. And it was running right by it. And I kept looking at that and thinking, well, why are we hauling water or running a hose to water these two pots when we could do the same with the drip system? So the one thing I didn't like about this is that we had to run the main line right over the step like that. And we did, you know, secure it better so it was more out of the way once we got it finalized. But the only other option here would be to try to run it down here along the sidewalk, or to try and dig under it. And I guess that's just what happens when you design a planting bed and drip system after the house is built. But those are all things to think about as you're trying to figure out how to lay out your drip system, is what obstacles are in the way and how are you going to address that. So so then this shows the other side of the planting bed, where we again ran individual lines out to these plants with emitters on the ends of those. And so this way we were only watering right where the individual plants were. There's no emitters in the main line itself. They're all right out here where the individual plants are located. And this shows a bigger shot of this bed. And you can see here, we've started to put some mulch over the top of the main line. And this is the end of the line here. So it's just one continuous line through all the planting beds in front and inside of the house there. And so it worked really well. It kept everything watered and was really nice to just be able to enjoy. And once we covered up with mulch, it was pretty much out of sight and was pretty self-sufficient. So
Caleb, on that photo, if I was to put that in, do I need to have one of those 1/4-inch hoses running to each individual plant with an emitter on the end of it? How do I determine how many emitters I do, where do they go, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. You know, it's based a little bit on the size of the plant. So obviously an annual, which some of these were, isn't going to need that much water. So, you know, 1 gallon per hour emitter is probably plenty sufficient for that. Some of these larger perennials, and I apologize, I don't remember any of the names of these at this point. But like this larger one back here, some of these perennials, we put some larger emitters, and I don't remember right now what we put on there. We probably put 2 gallon per hour on some of those larger perennial plants. And then on the spirea plant, that big shrub in the back, we looped it all the way around the shrub, and we had I think we had probably 4 different emitters, 4 separate emitters on that particular plant. And again, this is an example of how you could run one main line to water a wide variety of shrubs and wide variety of plants, all on the same line. And so it's going to be a little bit of experimentation, and I'll talk a little bit about how we can go about doing that and trying to determine. There are publications out there that show estimates of how much water this probably needs and how much water that probably needs. But some of it's just a little bit of trial and error too, to just say, well, I set it up, this is what I think it needs, and just checking to see, is it overwatering, is it underwatering, or is it about right? And really monitoring that system, especially on something like this where you do have multiple plants, both annuals, perennials, and shrubs on the same system, to really make sure that everything's getting its adequate water amount.
It does become a little bit trial and error.
Yeah.
And so once you get the system set up, run it for half an hour and see if that seems to be sufficient, and check out the different, set it for every 3rd day and see if that seems to be enough. If the plant seems stressed, maybe go to every other day, increase the time on the how long it's watering. But it's just one of those things that you kind of have to get a feel for. But it is more efficient than thinking, oh, did I water the flowers this week?
Yep. That was usually the question before we had this. That was the question. Did you water
exactly
today? No, I think I watered on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Well, and you're also going to want to check that system as the season goes along, right? So if we're putting in annual plants and they're really small to start with, and as they grow, they're going to, the water need is going to increase with the size of the plant. And then also with the seasonality, right? As we warm up into summer and get into the hot dog days of summer, and just the differences in day to day, it changes, right?
It does.
And so the water need of those plants and during the season is going to change too. And so you're going to want to be out there monitoring this. It's not a system to install and forget about it. At least a lot of the phone calls I get coming into my office are people that have installed the drip irrigation system, and then the plants are having problems, especially perennial plants, shrubs and trees, 2-3 years later or more later, and the tree essentially just not getting enough water because people aren't checking it or upgrading it as that plant matures.
Or the emitters are plugged, or, it could be a whole bunch of different things.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think you make a really valid point, and we need to think about these, especially with perennials and shrubs and trees, where we know these plants are increasing their root volume, they're increasing their size, which increases their water need. And hopefully we're watering them sufficiently that they're, rooting deeply enough that they're able to find some of their own moisture. But we do need to consider the possibility and not the possibility, but the inevitability that we will have to scale these systems up, and you may have to add emitters, you may have to increase the size of emitters, and so on and so forth. So the other thing that's really nice that they make is called goof plugs, right? So if you put a hole in your main line and then you decide, well, that's not working, you can plug it with a goof plug, and then you can do what you think is going to be better. So don't be so worried about putting holes in your line that you're going to screw something up, because you can fix it, you can change it, you can adapt, right? So
just don't forget to buy goof plugs.
Yes. Yeah. Make sure you add those to your list when you're planning everything else that you need.
Yes.
So got a question for you, Caleb, and maybe this will transition on. So there are people that have talked about inline emitters in the hose. Can you talk about that? And specifically for vegetables, like in a garden setting, how are those different than what you're talking about with this type of system? And what's the pros and cons to it?
Yeah, so that is another option. Now you can get what they call drip tape that has emitters built into it. And you can also get this, yep, just like Jeff has behind him. Yep, thank you. That's a great example of drip tape. And you can also buy the 1/4 inch line that we've been showing you with emitters built into it as well. Now you can get those at different spacings. I think typically 6, 12, and 18 inches is probably standard for those. But again, that'll vary.
I think down to 4 inches, Caleb.
Down to 4 inches. Okay.
Yeah.
And the benefit of that is, number one, you don't have to put in emitters because they're already built in. And depending on what you're planting, if it's a vegetable garden where you've got plants close together and you want to wet a larger area of that planting bed, then, that gives you the flexibility, the option to be able to do that. Now, for something like this, I probably wouldn't use it unless you wanted to do a loop around your plant instead of, putting multiple 1/4 inch lines coming out with multiple emitters. You can have a line of 1/4 inch tubing with built-in emitters that actually goes around the plant with the emitters already built in that would then provide the water to that plant. So you could achieve the same end by doing that, versus individual emitters that you're actually inserting yourself. So
I use a lot of drip tape in my landscaping and garden, and in my garden I use drip tape. In my landscaping I use the 1/4 inch line with the emitters already built in, and have pretty good luck with it.
And I think nice thing about those fit a little bit better, right? When you're in a cropping system like that, where it's a uniform planting, it's a uniform canopy, you're going to have more uniform water, and that's where those emitters are. And the closer the spacing, you want it for more densely planted plants, right? Carrots, lettuce, the greens, those kind of things. But as you get to more spaced out plants, maybe something like corn or something more like squash or cucumbers, you want those longer emitters, right? Those longer spacings. But they don't always work as well, especially like I think of perennials, like getting into tree rows and getting into shrub rows. Your spacing is so much farther apart and you need a larger volume of water at those points. Yeah. But like you said, using them as a loop around those trees could work out really well.
Yeah. And the nice thing too is about a lot of those lines where the drip emitters are built in is a lot of times they're pressure regulated, or you can get them pressure regulated, which isn't a huge deal if your landscape is relatively flat. But if you've got some hills and some different topography that you're trying to water, then that pressure regulating system will help to apply a more even distribution of water coming out of that system in each of those emitters. So that is a benefit of using those as well. And I don't know, are those individual emitters that you plug in, are some of those considered pressure compensating as well, Jeff?
That I don't know, Caleb, if they are or not. The plug-in.
It seems like it's mostly the drip tape.
Yeah. And there is a wide variety of drip tape out there. There's some of it that the emitters run the full length of it's just one solid emitter. I think Toro makes a product like that. And then there's other drip tapes where, again, they're on spacing that's 4, 6, 12, 18 inches apart. It just depends on what you need.
Yeah.
And that drip tape is more, if I understand it correctly, Jeff, at least when I used it, it's expendable. So it might last a year, might last a few years. It's not going to last indefinitely. And so you eventually just get rid of that drip tape and replace it.
Although the guys that install it underground are getting 20 years plus out of it. So, but above ground's a little more
not as forgiving.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Especially when the lawnmower goes over it.
Right. And rodents. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of that lawnmower blight coming back.
Yeah,
honestly.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So
Caleb?
Once we get through the components, we get through the design, you've got a system and you're pretty excited about it. The next question is, as we've alluded to, is how much do I water? How often do I water? Because to really take the full advantage of setting up a drip irrigation system, we need to come up with a system for how we're actually going to use it to make it efficient. And as it is with so many things, the answer is, it depends. Nobody likes to hear that answer, right? Everybody just wants you to say, run it for 20 minutes every third day, and everything's just going to be so happy. You'll just be so happy. It'll all be happy, and everybody will just go on their way. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. But once we go through some steps to help determine the answer to some of these questions, we can get to a point where it is that simple, as long as we are coming back to Jeremiah's point of inspecting the system and making sure that it's continuing to work properly. So we can't completely forget about it, but we can get to a point where we can set a timer and let it run on a regular basis to where it's going to be efficient and it's going to accomplish our needs. So some of the factors we need to consider is our soil type, our climate, our temperature variations between seasons as well, our plant rooting depth. So obviously larger plants have deeper roots, they have more roots, and they have larger water needs than smaller plants. Now, we can talk about, effective rooting depth of different plants. I'm going to talk today about just kind of focusing on the top 6 to 9 inches of the soil. Now, for some of our larger trees and shrubs, we might want to consider a little bit deeper than that, or at least be inspecting on a deeper level than maybe just 6 to 9 inches. But the way I look at it is, if we're talking about just regular irrigation applications that we're doing, I think that's a pretty good depth to consider between our perennials and our annuals and our garden and so on. I would say that we should be doing some deeper watering occasionally for our trees and our larger shrubs, where we're going to get that moisture down deeper. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about evaluating that top 6 to 9 inches. So there was a master gardener in Natrona County here years ago that developed a presentation that I've used previously called Watering on a 6-Pack. And the whole idea was that you go out, you turn on your sprinkler system on your lawn, and you let it run for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then you turn it off and you go with a shovel out to your yard, and don't really necessarily need to dig a hole, but you just put that spade in the ground and pull some sod back, see how deep that moisture got. Did it get down 2 inches or 5 inches? Did it get into that 6 to 9 inch depth? If it did, great. Then you're like, okay, I need to water for 15 minutes to get my water down 6 to 9 inches. If it didn't, then turn it on for another 10 minutes or 15 minutes and see, okay, after that second round, did it get down to where I want that moisture? And her whole title of this was that while you're waiting, you're sitting on a lawn chair enjoying your favorite beverage. So that's where watering on a 6-pack comes in. Because again, gardening, this is what we're talking about, right? It should be fun.
So wait a minute, Caleb. By the time you got to the 6th one and you're still digging holes in your yard to figure this out, you're probably not going to care if it's 6 to 9 inches deep.
Yeah, I know, maybe not. Yeah, depending on your beverage of choice, yeah, you might not. So you might need to save some beverages of choice until the second round.
So you're completely done with this project.
Yeah, yeah. But so really what we're trying to get at is you have to get out, you got to get your hands dirty, you got to dig in your soil, you got to see what's going on in your soil. And this isn't just a one and done for your yard either. You should do this for your lawn, you should do it for your perennial bed, your garden, every zone that you're going to set up, evaluate it the same way. And it's probably going to change, right? Based on climate, based on temperature, based on different factors. So you need to evaluate periodically. And as your plants grow, they're going to need more water. So this needs to be done, on a regular basis to just evaluate, make sure, are my plants doing well? Am I getting water where it needs to be? And again, we kind of talked about those things already, but take those factors into consideration. And the changing seasons. Just because you do it in the spring doesn't mean that in late July, early August, it's going to be the same thing. You might need to water a little bit more. hopefully you don't end up with a yard full of holes like this. Might depend on your beverage of choice.
And when your spouse asks you about the gopher problem in your yard, you better have a really good excuse.
Yeah, you better. Yeah. So when you get done with that, then the next question is, okay, well, how long before I have to water again? And it's the same process. You're gonna have to get your hands dirty, get in the soil, and see how long it takes for that top 6 to 9 inches to dry out. And if it's really hot out, you might actually think about that top 2 to 3 inches, right? Because if we're letting that really deep moisture dry out, it can be really hard to replace that in the heat of the summer. So again, it's a little of experimentation, but you've got to be able to go in there and get your hands dirty and see what's really going on in your landscape in order to determine what's going to be most effective for you. So then once we've got that done, we can start mulching. We can cover our plants with some mulch. We can cover our drip system. And so there's some things to think about. Don't mulch right up against the tree because that can cause some root rot and bark rot and disease to come in there. And don't make it too deep. So we don't want more than about 2 to 3 inches. And you can replace that mulch periodically, but that's going to help hold this moisture in where you want it to be. So it's going to help keep that soil from drying out as quickly. And it's one of the nice things about drip irrigation is you can lay it out there, cover it with mulch. It's just going to work, right? But as we've alluded to as well, we don't want to forget about maintenance. One of the most important things we need to do is inspect it to make sure that our emitters are still working. We are really prone to emitters clogging in Wyoming because we have really high pH, high calcium soils, and that same water that will form rings around your tub or in your sinks or in your cups and so on and so forth will do the same thing in your emitters, and it will clog them up. So you need to check that. You need to flush the system, at least in the spring and fall. And flushing the system means that you would run it, but you would open up the end of your main line and let that water just flush through that whole system and kind of drain some of that sediment and different things that have built up in there.
Sorry, Jeremiah. These 1/4 inch, the little nipples that hold everything together, they break pretty easily. Depends on if you have deer wandering through your landscape and they happen to step on something. But I have a couple a year, or when you're trimming or pruning your plants, you always cut a line.
Yep.
So there's always something to fix.
Well, and the other thing I was just going to say is when you're flushing the system, that's more for larger debris. So that's if you have sediment in the line or moss or algae in the line kind of thing. It's not going to blow out those emitters. It's not going to, if you're getting calcium deposits or those emitters are closing over because of chemistry in the water, it's not going to flush that out. You would have to do an acid to flush it. So that's what I just comment on that with the flushing of the system.
Yeah, and sometimes you can pull the emitter out if you can find the culprit and you can scrape it a little bit and try to clear it. But they're so cheap, sometimes you're better off to just replace it rather than keep dealing with the hassle of one that's working, partially now because you cleared the obstruction a little bit. So,
right.
Inevitably, you're compromising the amount of water getting to that plant too. So some fun things to talk about because there's so much innovation that's happened in technology and stuff. There's an app for that, like we say with everything else. If you want to, I'm sure lots of companies have these, but I was looking today at one from DripWorks where you can actually go in. They have a free trial, but then you can pay a subscription to this app that they have that will help you design your whole garden. But it's not only the irrigation. You can make notes. You can actually use it as a journal for your garden, to journal what you grew, how it did. It'll make recommendations about things you should be doing based on what you're growing. It's a whole journal kind of diary deal for your garden. But it will help you to design your drip system for the garden based on what plants you select and how you lay it out and stuff. So, that's an option. There's controllers now, water controllers that work on Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, so you can program them from your phone. You can turn them on and off and change stuff. And they've got, of course, like we have with systems for irrigating our lawn, you can attach these to rain gauges, and you can have the rain gauge, if it tracks so much moisture, it'll shut your system off. And so there's lots of technology out there that you can incorporate into these kind of things if that's something you're interested in doing. But I think the important message is too that it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to have any of that technology in there to make it work. So last thing here is some other innovations. So we talk about drip irrigation, we talk about emitters, with slowly dripping water to our plants, but there are sprinklers that you can utilize as part of your drip system as well. And I've talked to some people that really like them. They can be nice in a setting where you're trying to really water an area evenly to get germination. Sometimes germination with drip systems can be difficult because we are so targeted with our water that we might not reach all the seed bed. Transplant stress, it can really help there. It can help if you're wanting to water a group of containers in a certain area. It's a way to water, still in an efficient manner, but in more of a sprinkler type setting. And they are adjustable as well. So you can place one in a corner and just water away coming out from the corner, or you can water so like a 90-degree arc, 180-degree arc, or 360-degree arc. So there's some flexibility there in how you can set those up too. So I don't have as much experience with sprinklers. I don't know in drip systems. I don't know if you guys have used them much, but some people I've talked to have been really happy with them in their settings. So
I think it depends on what you're using. They have those micro sprinklers or bubblers that can attach instead of a drip emitter. And
yeah,
they're appropriate in certain areas. I think of them more in like a perennial flower bed or around shrubs or something like that, where you're wanting to put down a lot more water. We always discourage aerial watering of plants. And so those micro sprinklers kind of sit at a lower level. They're not spraying up over the foliage if we can help it. But especially the micro sprinklers, I don't think they're going to work real well in a garden setting, but those bubblers where it's putting it right out on the ground, those would work in a garden setting too. So,
yeah. The other thing that I think is really cool, and this is a way to save yourself a lot of money, if you wanted to set up 2 separate zones on 2 separate, timings and what have you, but you don't want to have to go buy the whole system again, the back, flush preventer, the filter, the timer, that can get expensive, especially depending on what timers you're purchasing and so on. So DripWorks has this, it's called the Galcon valve. And this is an automatic valve. Every time that water hits it, it switches to the other side. And so you can set your timer to come on 2 times a day, or maybe every other day. And the first day it waters one zone, and the next day it kicks the valve to the other side and it waters the other zone. So kind of a neat deal. This is, it retails for like $35. You can't even buy a timer for that much. So you're saving yourself a lot of money, but giving yourself more flexibility in the process. So there's a lot of innovations out there, and these systems are pretty adaptable to pretty much anything that you would want to do with them. And so don't be afraid to just get out and give it a try. So.
Awesome, Caleb. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with you. Just get out there. Don't be afraid. Try it out, and if it's your first time, just take a small project, right?
Yep.
Take a flower bed or take just part of the garden or your garden or whatever it is, and just experiment with it and get it. Sometimes the best way to get comfortable with this stuff is just how to just use it and just figure out how it works. And then, like Jeff and Caleb already said, it's a little bit trial and error once you have it in place, but over time, anybody can figure this out and you'll get it working for you. So I believe all the questions have been answered. So we're just going to close the show. Again, thank you so much, Caleb. This was fantastic. Thank you to all our participants for joining us this evening. It's been a fabulous show. Really glad to bring this specific topic to you guys. This kind of was an impromptu show to try and address some specific needs for this year with the dry conditions and everything. But with that, we're going to close out. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested, we have another show next week. Look at that. It's on Barnyards and Backyards Live. It's on the Barnyards and Backyards website there. If you missed this show, or if you want to show this show to somebody else or pass it on, go to the Barnyards Backyards website. Jenny pulled it up there for a minute and then it dropped away. But on there, we have all the past recordings from the Barnyards and Backyards live shows. So you can reference those. Any of the resources we mentioned, we try and put them up there as well. So it's a one-stop shop for you. Any future shows we're doing, we're going to put those up there and have that schedule there as well. So we have one more next week to wrap up this session of them. And it's going to be really great. If you got any other questions, reach out to your local conservation district. Reach out to your local extension office. There's one in every county. And for extension, we have one on the Wind River Indian Reservation as well. And so with that, thank you again so much for being here. Jenny has put in the chat box here on Zoom and the comment box on Facebook. There's a link in there to give us your feedback. We'd really love to have your feedback on these shows. This is why we do it. We do it for you. And so this is one way we can hear back from you to say what we've covered and your perspective on the show and what this has meant for you. So please take time and give us that feedback. And with that, thanks again, Caleb. Great presentation. We're just going to sign off and say goodnight to everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.